The sacred clearing of Valdron was built to humble the weak. It was an ancient, circular expanse carved into the heart of the deep forest, surrounded by towering, ancient pines that bled dark sap and blocked out the pale winter moon. The air here was always 10 degrees colder than the rest of the territory, heavy with the scent of frozen earth, crushed pine needles, and the latent aggression of 100 shifting wolves. Evangeline Vance stood at the very center of this freezing amphitheater. She wore a simple dress of coarse grey wool, her bare feet planted firmly on the frost-hardened ground. The wind howled through the high branches, biting at her exposed skin, turning her lips pale and her fingertips numb. Spidery patterns of ice clung to the hem of her skirt, but she did not shiver. She did not wrap her arms around herself for warmth. She simply stood, a solitary figure in a sea of expectant, hostile eyes, her spine straight and her chin lifted. The awakening ceremony was supposed to be the defining day of a Lycan's life. It was the moment the inner wolf clawed its way to the surface, bringing with it the golden rush of strength, the heightened senses and the sacred bond to the pack. Instead, it became the moment Evangeline Vance's entire world shattered. She could feel the collective gaze of the Valdron pack pressing down on her like a physical weight. They were waiting for the scream. They were waiting for her bones to crack and reform, for the sudden, triumphant howl to tear from her throat. But the space inside her chest, the hollow cavern where a wolf should have been pacing, snarling, fighting to break free, was entirely silent. There was no beast beneath her ribs. There was only Evangeline, a human girl with a strange, dormant lineage trapped in a world of teeth. The high elder of the pack stepped out from the shadowy perimeter of the trees. He moved with the slow, deliberate arrogance of a man who held absolute spiritual authority over the territory. He was draped in heavy ceremonial robes of deep crimson and black, the furs of fallen beasts adorning his broad shoulders. His face was weathered, carved with deep lines of harsh winters and harsher judgments, and his pale, tempestuous gaze was fixed on Evangeline with a look of profound disgust. He did not see a member of his pack. He saw a defect, a stain on the bloodline. In his right hand he carried the silver ritual blade. It was an ancient, wicked thing, its hilt wrapped in dark leather, the polished metal gleaming with a lethal icy light under the pale winter sun. Evangeline watched him approach. Her pulse remained steady. She focused on the physical sensations of the moment, anchoring herself to the harsh reality of the clearing to stave off the rising tide of humiliation. The icy bite of the stone beneath her arches, the rough texture of her wool dress against her collarbones, the smell of ozone, old blood, and wet fur. She knew what was coming. She had known since she was a child, since the days when the other pups had begun to growl and bare their fangs while she sat quietly, watching the world with strange, observant eyes. She was wolfless, an anomaly, a biological failure in a society that worshipped instinct and power. Evangeline of the House of Vance, the elder's voice boomed across the clearing, shattering the tense silence. It was a rough, gravelly sound that echoed off the trunks of the ancient pines. You stand before the moon goddess and pack on the dawn of your 18th year. The time for hiding is over. The time for truth has come. He stopped 3 paces from her. The scent of him was overwhelming. Sharp cedar, bitter myrrh, and the metallic tang of the silver he carried. Evangeline did not lower her gaze. She looked directly into his eyes, refusing to offer him the submissive bow he expected. The muscles in the elder's jaw ticked. His inner beast snarled at the blatant disrespect from an omega, a wolfless nothing. But he could not strike her. Not yet. The ritual had to be observed. "Give me your hand," he commanded, his tone dropping to a dangerous, vibrating growl. Evangeline slowly raised her right arm. Her hand was small, the skin calloused from years of menial labor in the pack's kitchens and gardens. She held it out, palm up, her fingers perfectly steady. She did not tremble. She did not pull back. The elder stepped into her personal space. The sheer, suffocating heat of his dominant aura washed over her, a physical pressure designed to force weaker wolves to their knees. Evangeline's human biology did not register the command. She remained standing. The elder's eyes narrowed into slits. He grabbed her wrist with his free hand. His grip was brutal, his blunt fingers digging into her fragile bones with enough force to leave deep, purple bruises by nightfall. The sudden contrast of his burning skin against her freezing flesh made her stomach tighten, but she kept her face entirely blank. He raised the gleaming ceremonial dagger. The metal caught the light, flashing violently, before he brought the edge down across her open palm. The pain was immediate and blinding. The silver burned like liquid fire as it sliced through her skin. A searing chemical agony that was far worse than a simple cut. Evangeline's jaw locked. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted the metallic tang of copper, forcing the pain down into the silent, empty hollow of her chest. She refused to make a sound. She would not give them the satisfaction of her cries. The elder released her wrist. He stepped back, allowing the crowd to see. The blood welled up from the deep gash, bright and startlingly red against her pale skin. It pooled in the center of her palm for a long, agonizing second before spilling over the edge, falling to hit the frost-covered stone at her feet. The clearing fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Hundreds of wolves held their breath, their eyes fixed on the crimson droplets staining the white snow. According to the ancient texts, when the sacred metal tasted the blood of a true Lycan, the wound would immediately sizzle with a golden spark. The inner wolf would roar in defense, forcing the physical body to heal, to shift, to prove its divine right to exist. But there was no golden spark, there was no sudden surge of heat, no supernatural healing, no beast rising from the depths. There was only the slow, rhythmic falling of human blood, steaming slightly in the freezing air. Evangeline stood perfectly still. The physical burning of the silver in her veins throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a heavy, agonizing rhythm. She watched her own blood seep into the frozen earth. It was ordinary. It was weak. It was the final, undeniable proof of her lack of worth to them. The elder stared at the blood on the snow for a long moment. Then, a slow, cruel smile twisted his weathered features. He raised the blood-stained blade high above his head, turning to face the surrounding pack. "The blood speaks," he roared, his voice ringing with triumphant malice. "There is no beast within this flesh. There is no power, no instinct, no connection to the goddess. Evangeline Vance is wolfless." A collective murmur rippled through the trees. It started as a low, rumbling growl of disgust and quickly escalated into a chorus of mocking snarls and jeering laughter. The sound hit Evangeline like a physical blow, a wave of pure, concentrated hatred and derision. These were the people she had grown up with. The warriors she had cooked for, the elders she had tended to, when the winter fevers struck, the pups she had bandaged. Now they looked at her as if she were a rotting carcass left in the sun. Then the crowd parted. A solitary figure stepped forward into the sacred circle, his boots crunching heavily on the frost. It was her betrothed, the young warrior who, only a moon ago, had promised to stand by her side, regardless of what the goddess revealed. He was supposed to be her shield. He was supposed to claim her before the elders tonight, weaving their lives together in the sacred bond that would secure her place in the hierarchy. But as he looked down at the human blood staining the snow, his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. There was no love left in his gaze, only a profound, suffocating shame. He looked at her as if her very presence insulted his lineage. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding. He raised his voice, ensuring every wolf in the territory could hear his betrayal over the howling wind. "I, a warrior of Valdron, look upon this wolfless flesh and feel only disgrace," he declared, his voice cold and flat. "I reject this bond. I reject you, Evangeline Vance." The words struck her with the physical force of a hammer. A sudden, violent, tearing sensation ripped through her chest, a phantom agony that stole the breath from her lungs as the unformed mating bond was brutally severed. The physical pain of the rejection was infinitely worse than the bite of the silver blade. It was a deep, internal burning, leaving behind a raw, echoing emptiness. The ceremony was supposed to break her. Everyone expected her to shatter right then and there. They expected tears, begging, the pitiful collapse of an Omega who had dared to dream of acceptance. They wanted her to drop to her knees in the freezing mud and plead for mercy from the male who had just discarded her, to cry out her devotion to a pack that despised her. But Evangeline didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply reached out with her uninjured left hand, tore a piece of rough fabric from the hem of her grey dress, and calmly wrapped it around her bleeding right palm. She pulled the makeshift bandage tight with her teeth, tying it off with methodical precision. The physical action grounded her. It kept her from falling apart. She lifted her chin and looked directly at the male who had broken her heart, and then at the elder. Her dark eyes were devoid of fear, devoid of sorrow. They were empty, beautiful the way a frozen lake was beautiful, cold, reflective, and completely impenetrable. "I accept," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried effortlessly through the sudden, shocked silence of the clearing. She did not raise her tone. She did not inflect with anger. "I am wolfless. I claim no place among the Valdron pack." The elder's triumphant smile faltered. The lack of a reaction, the absolute stoic dignity in her posture, unsettled his inner beast. A wolf understood submission. A wolf understood dominance. But this quiet, unyielding silence was something entirely alien. He took a threatening step forward, wanting to break her composure, wanting to see her tremble. Before the elder could issue his final decree of exile, a voice cut through the icy air. It was smooth, elegant, and dripping with poisonous grace. A defect cannot be permitted to remain within the territory, not even as a servant. Lady Beatrice Thorne stepped out from the crowd of onlookers. She moved with the predatory silent grace of a snow leopard. She was breathtakingly beautiful in the way a winter frost was beautiful, sharp, blinding, and entirely lethal. She wore a heavy gown of silver and pale grey silk, completely unsuited for the harsh woodland environment, yet entirely spotless. A thick white fox fur draped elegantly over her arms. Her pale blonde hair was pinned back in intricate braids, and her ice-blue eyes gleamed with cold calculation. The scent of her rolled across the clearing, sweet, cloying lilies masking a bitter, underlying note of poisoned honey. Beatrice was an ambitious noblewoman, a visiting strategist who used forged documents and ancestral pressure to manipulate the pack's hierarchy and force her way into royal favor. She was the one who had quietly orchestrated the hostility around Evangeline over the past year, forging ledgers to blame the wolfless girl for missing apothecary supplies, ensuring Evangeline would be completely isolated. She stopped beside the elder, offering him a flawless, shallow smile. It was just deep enough to show respect, but shallow enough to maintain her own perceived high status. "She is a drain on our resources," Beatrice continued, her voice a soothing, deadly purr. She did not look at Evangeline, but lifted a single, manicured finger and pointed directly at the gates of the settlement, visible through the trees. "Evangeline Vance possesses no beast, no inner strength, and therefore no value to our breeding lines or our warriors. She must be cast out into the frozen pine forest, to freeze." The cruelty of the suggestion was absolute. To cast a human out into the freezing wilderness without provisions or protection was a guaranteed death sentence. Evangeline felt a slow, icy dread curl in her stomach, but her expression remained an impenetrable mask. She kept her jaw locked, her bleeding hand pressed tightly against her ribs. She looked at Beatrice. The noblewoman's face was a portrait of serene, polite malevolence. She was tying up a loose end, discarding the trash. We are small things in a world of teeth. Evangeline had always known this day would come. She had prepared for it in the silent, dark hours of the night, packing her few meager belongings into a single canvas sack hidden near the kitchens. The elder opened his mouth to formally issue the banishment. Beatrice demanded, but before the words could leave his throat, the deep, resonant blast of a war horn shattered the winter air. The sound was massive, terrifyingly loud, vibrating through the trunks of the ancient pines and rattling the frost from the branches. It was not a Valdron horn. It was deeper, heavier, forged from cold iron and ancient magic. The jeering of the pack stopped instantly. The wolves stiffened, their ears pinning back, their nostrils flaring as a new scent invaded the clearing. It was the smell of forged steel, burning embers, and the overwhelming, crushing dominance of an empire. Evangeline froze, the temperature in the clearing seeming to drop another 10 degrees, the air growing so dense it was difficult to breathe. She turned her head slowly, looking toward the southern tree line. Through the dense fog and the falling snow, a line of massive war horses emerged. They were terrifying beasts, bred for endurance and violence, their coats as black as pitch, their hooves striking the frozen ground with the synchronized rhythm of a marching army. The riders were clad in heavy articulated plate armor of dark steel, the pauldrons forged into the shape of snarling wolves. These were the elite royal guard of the Obsidian Keep. At the head of the formation rode Commander Ronald Cale. He was a mountain of a man, his physical presence so imposing that the Valdron warriors instinctively took a step back as his horse pushed through the perimeter of the clearing. His armor was scarred and battered, telling tales of brutal campaigns and ruthless suppression. A thick cloak of dark wolf fur spilled over his broad shoulders, secured by a heavy silver clasp bearing the royal crest. His face was a map of rigid discipline, sharp cheekbones, a strong, inflexible jaw, and a pair of cold, assessing hazel eyes that missed nothing. He carried the scent of blood, polished leather, and absolute authority. Ronald brought his massive warhorse to a halt, right at the edge of the sacred circle. The beast snorted, a cloud of white steam billowing from its nostrils. The commander did not dismount. He sat high in his saddle, looking down at the gathered pack, his gaze sweeping over the scene with clinical detachment. He saw the elder in his ceremonial robes. He saw the noblewoman in her fine silks. He saw the blood on the snow, and he saw the small, stoic girl standing alone in the center, clutching a crudely bandaged hand. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous. Even the high elder, for all his local arrogance, lowered his head slightly, his throat exposed in a sign of reluctant submission to the crown's authority. Commander Cale reached into a cylindrical leather case strapped to his saddle and pulled out a thick roll of heavy parchment. It was bound by a cord of dark silk and sealed with a massive dollop of black wax bearing the emblem of King Alistair Sterling. High Elder of Valdron, Ronald's voice rang out. It was a deep, resonant baritone, entirely devoid of emotion. I bring a decree from the sovereign. The winterbane curse that plagues the royal bloodline deepens. The keep requires a tribute from each of the major packs to serve the ancient halls and manage the royal apothecaries. The elder swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. To send one of his strong, capable warriors to the keep was a devastating blow to the pack's resources. He opened his mouth to negotiate, but Lady Beatrice Thorne stepped forward instantly, seizing the opportunity to rid themselves of Evangeline while simultaneously appeasing the crown. Commander Cale, Beatrice offered smoothly, executing another shallow curtsy. The Valdron pack is deeply honored to fulfill the crown's request. We have the perfect candidate. She pointed her manicured finger at Evangeline once more. Evangeline has managed the apothecary gardens. She knows herbs. She knows silence. We gladly offer her to the Ashen Throne. Commander Ronald Cale finally turned his head to look fully at Evangeline. His heavy gaze swept over her small, fragile frame, taking in the coarse grey dress, the bare, freezing feet, the blood steadily soaking through the crude bandage on her hand. He assessed her with the clinical eye of a soldier evaluating a broken weapon. Then his lip curled in a faint sneer of dismissal. "She is bleeding," Ronald observed bluntly, his voice devoid of pity. "And she is completely wolfless. The Ashen Throne is an ancient petrified artifact that drains the life force of the weak. The keep does not need fragile things that will shatter under the weight of a tray before they even reach the palace steps." He looked back at Beatrice and the elder, his eyes narrowing with dangerous authority. "King Alistair Sterling commands strength," Commander Cale rumbled, his voice echoing like thunder across the clearing. "The keep does not accept the cast-offs of a border pack. You will select a true lichen of strong blood to serve the crown, and have them waiting at the gates by the next new moon." Do not insult the sovereign with your garbage again." Without waiting for a response, Ronald Cale wheeled his massive warhorse around. The heavy hooves struck the frozen earth, kicking up chunks of frost and dirt. The Royal Guard fell into formation behind him, moving with terrifying precision as they rode out from under the shadow of the ancient pines, leaving the Valdron pack in stunned silence. Evangeline watched them go. She had not been saved. She had simply been deemed too worthless to even serve as a sacrifice. Furious at the commander's public rebuke, the elder turned his wrath entirely upon Evangeline. His face was a mask of furious, unadulterated hatred. He needed a target for his humiliation, and the silent, unyielding human girl was the perfect vessel. "Remove her cloak," the elder snarled to the guard standing at the edge of the clearing. "Take her name. March her to the boundary." Rough hands grabbed her arms. They did not give her time to fetch her canvas sack. They did not let her put on boots. Two massive warriors hauled Evangeline through the snow, dragging her away from the sacred clearing and down the winding path that led to the towering iron gates of the Valdron settlement. The entire pack followed, a silent, hostile procession, watching the final expulsion of their greatest shame. When they reached the boundary, the guards shoved her violently forward. Evangeline stumbled, her bare knees hitting the freezing, packed snow just beyond the threshold. She scrambled upright immediately, refusing to stay on the ground. She turned to face them. Lady Beatrice Thorne stood just inside the gates, her pale blonde braids pristine, her glacial gaze shining with absolute victory. Beside her, the elder raised his hand. The massive iron gates groaned on their heavy hinges. The sound was deafening, a horrible, scraping finality that echoed through the deep pines. The iron slammed shut with a reverberating crash, the heavy locking bar dropping into place. "You are dead to us," the elder's muffled voice carried through the thick iron bars. Evangeline stood on the outside. The wind immediately tore at her thin grey dress, the cold slicing through to her bones. She was entirely alone. No pack, no mate, no sanctuary. She looked at the towering iron gates for one long, silent moment, feeling the absolute physical reality of her isolation. She didn't cry. She didn't beg them to open the gates. Evangeline slowly raised her uninjured hand and pressed it flat against her chest, right over her heart. Hidden beneath the coarse fabric of her dress, tucked inside a small leather pouch, rested the dormant winter-bloom seed her mother had given her. It felt strangely warm against her freezing skin. She turned her back on the iron gates. The frozen pine forest of the Blackwood stretched out before her, dark and imposing and waiting. Evangeline pulled her thin shoulders back, drew in a slow breath of the freezing, bitter air, and walked into the shadows of the trees without looking back. 3 months of absolute silence. 3 months of scraping a brutal survival from the frozen, unforgiving earth of the deep woods. The royal carriage rolled to a grinding, heavy halt, its iron-banded wheels scraping violently against the black basalt courtyard of the ancient black fortress of Valdron. The journey from her hidden, dilapidated cabin in the frozen pine forest had taken 3 excruciating days, but the physical transition felt like crossing the threshold into the underworld. Evangeline Vance stepped out of the velvet-lined carriage, her worn leather boots, scavenged during her desperate first weeks of exile, hitting the frost-covered stone with a quiet thud. The keep was a towering fortress built to crush the spirit of anyone who looked upon it. It was not a place of light, warmth, or salvation. The massive walls of polished black glass and obsidian stretched endlessly upward, piercing the low-hanging bruised winter clouds like a row of jagged teeth. There were no bright banners snapping in the wind, no boastful guards displaying their strength in the courtyards, no sounds of civilian life spilling from the heavy iron gates. There was only a suffocating heavy silence. The air here was incredibly dense, smelling strongly of burning ozone, crushed sulfur, and the metallic tang of old blood. It was the unmistakable scent of a dying empire. She did not tremble. Evangeline was very good at being unseen. She had survived the massive predators of the frozen timberland by becoming a ghost. moving silently through the shadows, while the alpha wolves hunted blindly past her. She had survived by dragging a massive, bleeding black wolf out of a deep snowdrift on her 70th day of exile, pressing her calloused, bare hands into its freezing fur to pack its torn flesh with crushed winter root and yarrow. She hadn't known the beast was a sovereign. She hadn't known the terrifying creature she nursed, back to health in the blinding snow, was a man. Not until the royal guard had surrounded her cabin yesterday, delivering a summons from the crown that could not be refused. A contingent of silent, heavily armored guards escorted her up the massive stone steps. The temperature shifted violently as she crossed the threshold of the grand entrance. Outside, the winter wind was a physical blade, biting and relentless. Inside, the air was unnaturally thick and hot, rolling over her skin like the exhaust of a dying furnace. It was a dry, suffocating heat that instantly made her lungs ache and her throat parch. The walls themselves seemed to bleed warmth, radiating an aggressive, volatile energy that prickled against the nape of her neck. They led her through winding, cavernous corridors lit only by the dim, sputtering light of wall-mounted oil lamps. The shadows clung to the high-vaulted ceilings like heavy cobwebs, making the massive space feel strangely claustrophobic despite its staggering size. The sound of her boots on the stone was swallowed by the sheer mass of the architecture. Finally, the guards halted before a pair of towering double doors forged from solid black iron. The metal was intricately etched with the snarling visages of ancient, mythical beasts. The soldiers pushed the doors open, the massive hinges groaning with a heavy metallic shriek that echoed down the empty hall. Evangeline stepped inside. The royal solar was vast, yet deeply shadowed. The oppressive heat in this room was almost unbearable, a suffocating blanket that smelled intensely of bitter ash, decaying cedarwood, and a dark underlying sickness. Near the massive stone hearth stood Elder Gideon Croft. The weathered, quiet royal physician looked utterly exhausted. His shoulders slumped beneath his heavy grey robes. His hands were stained faint green from crushed hemlock and yarrow, and as Evangeline entered, his sharp, intelligent eyes locked onto hers. He recognized the stoic girl. He recognized the specific, ancient markers in the herbal remedies that had kept his monarch alive in the snow, realizing instantly that this fragile, wolfless human possessed a profound understanding of the earth that his own royal training lacked. Gideon gave her a single, microscopic nod of acknowledgement, then bowed his head and stepped back into the shadows of the alcove, leaving her to face the center of the room. At the far end of the solar, standing with his broad back to the massive arched window, was King Alistair Stirling. He was a terrifying physical presence. The monarch was built like a god of war, his shoulders impossibly wide beneath a heavy fur-lined mantle of midnight black. But as he slowly turned to face her, Evangeline saw the catastrophic ruin lying just beneath the veneer of absolute power. The lethal sovereign's curse was actively eating him alive. Dark, spidery veins of necrotic black magic crawled up the sides of his muscular neck, disappearing into the sharp line of his jaw. His skin held a grey, ashen pallor, a stark, sickly contrast to the thick, wild waves of his dark hair. But it was his eyes that truly commanded the room. They were storm grey, swirling with the violent, suppressed agony of a predator chained in the dark. They locked onto Evangeline with a heavy physical weight, searching her plain, composed face for any sign of weakness. In his massive right hand, the ruler held an obsidian chalice. The object was ancient, carved from the same indestructible black stone as the fortress itself. But as Evangeline watched in quiet observation, she saw the sheer, toxic output of the ancient curse actively destroying the vessel. The indestructible stone was decaying. It flaked and crumbled beneath his grip like dry dirt, dropping fine black dust onto the polished floorboards. The curse was a physical rot, a lethal aura that deteriorated anything he touched. "You did not run when the carriage arrived at your cabin," Alistair spoke. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, vibrating low in his expansive chest. It sounded like heavy stones grinding together deep underground. There was a roughness to it, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that he could barely conceal beneath his royal authority. "Running requires energy, Your Majesty," Evangeline replied evenly. Her tone was perfectly flat, completely devoid of the trembling reverence or terror he was accustomed to hearing from his subjects. She kept her spine entirely straight, her hands resting quietly at her sides, and the woods do not forgive those who waste their breath. The king's jaw tightened. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sheer, suffocating heat of his dominant aura spiked, creating a physical pressure in the room that would have forced a lesser lichen to drop to their knees, bare their throat, and whimper for mercy. But the girl standing before him possessed no inner wolf to submit. The crushing dominance rolled right over her, completely ineffective against her silent, hollow biology. She simply watched him, her dark eyes observant, analytical and entirely unafraid. He looked down at the crumbling chalice in his hand, then placed it heavily on a thick oak table. The wood immediately hissed, a small burn mark spreading outward where the cursed stone made contact. "You stitched my flesh when I was trapped in my lesser form," Alistair murmured, closing the distance between them until he was only 3 paces away. The scent of him was overwhelming up close. A chaotic, intense blend of burning pine, masculine musk, and the sharp, acidic tang of dark magic. "You touched a beast that radiated death, and your hands did not freeze. The royal physicians claim you possess an apothecary's gift. I brought you here to manage the medicinal gardens, to brew the draughts that might keep this rot at bay." Evangeline looked at the dark, pulsating veins crawling up his throat. She saw the minute, involuntary tremors in his massive hands, the way he rigidly locked his muscles to stop the shaking. He was a sovereign fighting a losing war against his own tainted blood. He was a king preparing to die. "The herbs can only soothe the physical symptoms," she said quietly, her dark eyes tracking the spidery patterns of ice and necrotic magic tracing his collarbone. "They cannot extract a curse forged in ancient blood. I do not require a cure. I require time." Alistair gritted out, his dark, roiling gaze flashing with a sudden, dangerous intensity. He leaned down slightly, his massive frame looming over her small, fragile one, forcing her to look up. "But you must understand the gravity of this sanctuary. The keep is not a haven, it is a graveyard for the weak. Specifically, the chamber beyond this solar." He lifted a heavily scarred hand and gestured toward a massive stone archway draped in thick, impenetrable black velvet. "The Ashen Throne resides there," the monarch continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. "It is forged from petrified black wood, older than the bloodlines of this court. It demands strength. It feeds on the vitality of the sovereign who sits upon it, and it instantly drains the life from anyone who lacks the supreme resilience of the goddess's favor. Do not go near it. Do not look at it. If your human hands brush that wood, it will turn your bones to ash in a single heartbeat." Evangeline looked toward the heavy velvet drapes. The moment his warning left his lips, she felt a strange, distinct pulling sensation deep in her chest. It was a bizarre, humming resonance, echoing from the dormant winter-bloom seed, hidden in the leather pouch against her heart. The sacred thread woven between her soul and the ancient magic of the keep stirred. The throne room felt less like a seat of political power, and more like a starving, open mouth waiting in the dark. It felt like a void. It felt like her. She turned her gaze back to the towering man. He didn't know that the woman standing before him had already been shattered by a world that worshipped unyielding strength. He didn't know she had absolutely nothing left to lose. "I am here to tend the gardens, not the throne," she answered simply. She did not bow. She did not offer him empty, poetic promises of undying loyalty. "I will brew your draughts. I will stay in the shadows, where I belong." Alistair stared at her, an unreadable, complex emotion flickering in the depths of his agonizing gaze. She was so small, so entirely devoid of the shifting magic that defined his violent world, yet she stood before a rotting king and an empire of death without a single flinch. He slowly exhaled, the rigid tension in his broad shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as the need for intimidation faded. The physical agony of the lethal curse seemed to momentarily recede in the quiet, stoic face of her absolute indifference. "See that you do," he rumbled softly, the aggressive edge vanishing from his tone entirely, replaced by a weary, hollow ache. "For your own sake, we are all dying here. Do not rush to join the Count." Deep within the frigid, shadowed corridors of the eastern wing, Lady Beatrice Thorne moved through the gloom with the silent, predatory grace of a phantom. The air down here was brutally cold. The torches mounted on the uneven stone walls sputtered wildly, constantly threatening to die in the unnatural. Freezing drafts that swept up from the dungeons. Here, away from the immediate oppressive heat of the Sovereign's curse, the keep felt exactly like a massive, forgotten tomb. Beatrice had arrived at the Obsidian Keep 3 days prior, her flawless, pale blonde braids and heavy silk gowns looking entirely out of place against the brutal military architecture. She had manipulated her way into the inner royal court using a complex web of forged ancestral documents and whispered promises of military alliances, flawlessly positioning herself as a necessary diplomatic fixture during the king's failing health. She carried the overpowering scent of cloying lilies, heavily masking the bitter, underlying aroma of poisoned honey. It was a scent that commanded attention, a sweet, chemical-heavy blanket that coated the back of the throat and refused to let go. She paused at the intersection of 2 vaulted hallways, her pale, frost-colored irises scanning the deep shadows. She waited in absolute silence, listening to the heavy, synchronized rhythm of armored boots approaching from the western stairwell. Commander Ronald Cale emerged from the gloom. The massive head of the Royal Guard looked even more imposing within the dark confines of the keep. His scarred, dark steel armor absorbed the dim light, and his thick wolf fur cloak flared slightly around his broad shoulders with each heavy, methodical stride. His hazel eyes were cold, assessing, and relentlessly vigilant. He was a man composed entirely of iron discipline, his entire existence dedicated to the preservation of the crown at any cost. Beatrice stepped out of the shadows, smoothly blocking his path. "Commander," she purred, her voice a soothing, deadly melody that echoed softly against the damp stone. She offered a shallow, flawless curtsy, her silver and grey silks rustling loudly over the floorboards. Ronald stopped instantly. His massive hand rested casually on the pommel of his broadsword. He did not bow in return. His posture remained rigidly upright, his strong jaw locking tight. He recognized the noblewoman, and he recognized the particular, ambitious brand of poison she represented. The inner wolf beneath his skin bristled at the sickly sweet smell of her perfume. "Lady Thorne," Ronald replied, his baritone voice flat and entirely devoid of warmth. "The eastern wing is restricted strictly to the guard and the apothecary staff. You have wandered far from the guest solars." "I find the guest solars unbearably stuffy," Beatrice said, taking a slow, deliberate step closer. She lifted her hand, her long, manicured fingers delicately tracing the edge of a small, intricately carved stone alcove in the wall. "Besides, I was hoping to intercept you. I understand our mutual acquaintance from the forest has finally arrived." The commander's expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his cheek. He had personally overseen the delivery of the royal summons to the deep woods. "The human girl has been assigned to the medicinal gardens per the sovereign's strict decree. She is of no concern to the court. She is a tool, nothing more." "Oh, but she is a concern," Beatrice countered softly, a cruel, beautiful smile touching the corners of her pale lips. "She is a glaring weakness, Commander. A fragile, wolfless liability wandering the halls of a dying empire. The king's mind is clouded by his physical agony. He brings a peasant to brew his tea while the realm teeters on the edge of collapse. He requires a true mate, a strong, pure-blooded Luna to anchor his magic and secure the lineage before the curse consumes him entirely." She let the implication hang heavily in the freezing air, her ice-blue eyes locking onto his stoic face. Beatrice was actively positioning herself for the crown. It was the worst-kept secret in the palace, a steady, relentless campaign of political manipulation designed to slide her into the queen's seat The very moment the king's resistance finally shattered, Ronald remained completely silent for a long, tense moment. He evaluated her words, his tactical mind weighing the brutal realities of their situation. He despised Beatrice's political maneuvering, but he could not deny the absolute truth of the king's rapid deterioration. Alistair needed a powerful lichen anchor, not a human gardener who would snap under the pressure of the court. The empire was built on strength, and currently the throne was bleeding out. Seeing his hesitation, Beatrice reached into the deep, hidden pocket of her silk gown. She withdrew a small, meticulously folded object. It was a length of deep crimson velvet ribbon. The fabric was stunningly rich, soft, and vibrant against a dark, depressing stone. But as she held it up between her pale fingers, the faint, acrid smell of silver root and nightshade drifted from the material. It was a poisoned velvet ribbon, laced with a highly concentrated paralytic transdermal compound designed to severely weaken the nervous system of anyone who handled it bare-handed. "The king's condition worsens daily," the noblewoman whispered, stepping boldly into Ronald's personal space, holding the lethal ribbon up to the flickering torchlight. "When the coup of succession inevitably begins, the court will demand a demonstration of absolute strength. The Ashen Throne will be the proving ground." She trailed the edge of the velvet lightly over the scarred, cold metal of the commander's pauldron. "The wolfless girl is currently tending the king's private solar," Beatrice continued, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous hiss. "She is unprotected. If she were to be gently guided into the throne room during her cleaning duties. If she were given this ribbon to polish the dais, the paralytic would quickly disorient her. She would stumble. She would fall against the petrified wood. The ancient magic of the Ashen Throne would turn her fragile human bones to dust in seconds." Ronald stared down at the lethal strip of crimson fabric. The air between them grew impossibly tight, and with the human eradicated, Beatrice finished, her smile widening into a mask of pure predatory ambition. "The king will clearly see the necessity of a true, powerful mate, one who can touch the throne without shattering. The queen's seat will be secured, the lineage stabilized, and your sovereign will live." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the crushing weight of impending treason. The commander was bound by a sacred oath to protect the inhabitants of the keep. But his ultimate, unyielding loyalty was to the survival of the crown itself. The weak had always been sacrificed to preserve the strong. It was the fundamental, brutal law of their kind. He looked at the ribbon, then up at the calculating, icy gaze of the woman standing before him. He didn't care for Evangeline. To him she was a broken tool, a temporary, useless distraction that the king had inexplicably brought into a war zone. If her sudden death secured the empire's future and forced the king to take a strong mate, it was a tactically acceptable loss. Ronald did not reach out to take the ribbon. He simply took a slow, heavy step back, breaking the dangerous proximity. He refused to hold the murder weapon, but he would not block the blade. "The Royal Guard patrols the eastern wing on a strict, unyielding rotation," he rumbled, his voice low and utterly devoid of emotion. "However, the corridor leading to the throne room is left entirely unguarded during the third hour of the night, to allow the sovereign absolute privacy in his suffering. Anyone walking those halls at that exact time would be completely unseen, unchecked." Beatrice's smile turned razor-sharp. He had not explicitly agreed to commit the murder himself, but he had just handed her the keys to the execution chamber. He was going to look the other way. "How incredibly fortunate," she murmured, slipping the poisoned velvet ribbon back into the hidden folds of her gown. The deadly fabric vanished, swallowed instantly by the elegant silk. "A king needs a strong foundation, Commander. We are simply clearing away the useless debris." Ronald Cale gave a single stiff nod. He turned on his heel, his heavy cape sweeping the floorboards, and marched away into the darkness, leaving the ambitious noblewoman alone in the freezing corridor. Beatrice watched him go, the scent of lilies and poisoned honey lingering heavily in the stagnant air. The trap was set. The wolfless girl would burn on the cursed wood. and a new queen would rise from her ashes. The damp, weeping stone of the lower apothecary wings smelled of dry dust, crushed lavender and the bitter, lingering ghost of ancient remedies. It was a cavernous, draughty subterranean chamber buried deep beneath the grand, oppressive architecture of the royal solars, devoid of the rich tapestries and polished basalt that adorned the upper levels. This was a place built of shadows, where the forgotten of the subterranean royal citadel of Valdron were left to steep in the silence of centuries. The air down here was profoundly stagnant. It clung to everything, turning the chill into a living entity that sought to gnaw at exposed skin, creeping up through the soles of boots and settling deep into fragile joints. A single, sputtering oil lamp cast long, distorted shadows against the uneven walls, fighting a losing battle against the encroaching dark. Evangeline Vance sat perfectly still at the center of a massive oak workbench. The freezing draught, sweeping under the thick iron-banded door, bit mercilessly at her ankles, but she did not shiver. She was methodically crushing dried winter root with a solid granite pestle. The repetitive, grinding sound echoed sharply in the silence. It was a rhythmic anchor in the gloom, a steady cadence that kept her grounded when the sheer weight of the ancient fortress threatened to crush her into dust. Her right hand, still bearing the thick, raised scar from the consecrated dagger that had severed her from her past, ached with a dull, rhythmic throb in the cold. It was a phantom pain. It was a visceral reminder of the day she had been declared wolfless and cast out into the merciless snow. She ignored the physical discomfort. She focused solely on the rough texture of the stone beneath her fingertips, the sharp, acidic scent of the root breaking open, and the absolute necessity of her quiet labor. Staying alive required stillness. Endurance required work. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury afforded only to those who had someone to catch them when they fell. Evangeline had no one. The thick door did not creak when it opened. It swung inward with a soft, oiled whisper, letting in a sudden rush of freezing air that made the oil lamp flicker violently, threatening to plunge the room into absolute darkness. Elder Gideon Croft stepped out of the suffocating darkness of the hallway. The royal physician looked drastically diminished in the dim light. He had stripped off his thick, formal grey robes, wearing only a simple tunic that highlighted the severe slope of his exhausted shoulders. He moved with the laboured, anxious steps of a man who believed he was being actively hunted by unseen predators. The scent of him hit Evangeline instantly. A chaotic, unsettling mixture of sharp fear, stale sweat, and the overpowering, cloying aroma of crushed hemlock used to mask the smell of rot. His silver hair was dishevelled, plastered to his forehead with nervous perspiration. He looked utterly broken. The heavy burden of serving the sovereign had finally fractured his brilliant mind. He did not announce his presence. He simply crossed the stone floor, his boots scuffing lightly, until he stood on the opposite side of her workbench. He looked as though he had aged a full decade since he first brought her to these chambers. His breathing was shallow and frantic, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if expecting assassins to materialize from the damp stone itself. Evangeline stopped grinding the winter root. She did not startle. She did not drop the pestle, or demand to know why a high-ranking member of the court had slunk into a servant's quarters in the dead of night. She simply laid the granite tool down and looked up at him. Her dark eyes were unreadable. They were beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. Sharp, cold, and waiting. The old man reached into the deep pocket of his tunic. His fingers were trembling so violently he could barely manipulate the fabric. The faint green stains of his profession were stark against his pale, bloodless knuckles. He withdrew a small, intricate glass vial and placed it gently on the oak wood between them. The glass clinked softly against the timber. Inside the vessel sloshed a liquid so dense and dark it looked like liquid shadow. It caught the meager light of the oil lamp, shimmering with a lethal, oily, violet sheen that seemed to swallow the illumination around it. The room grew fractionally colder simply by its presence. "The court is a labyrinth of teeth, child," Gideon whispered, His voice was a hoarse, ragged scrape in the quiet room. He kept his eyes fixed on the vial, unable to meet her steady gaze. "And you have been dropped directly into the center of the feeding frenzy. The noble woman from your past does not intend to let you see the dawn. Lady Beatrice Thorne has been whispering to the guard. She has been pacing the corridors outside the throne room, plotting your end with the precision of a venomous spider. I have heard the whispers in the grand hall. She carries the poisoned crimson velvet ribbon." Evangeline looked at the dark liquid. The scent drifting from the poorly sealed cork was unmistakable. It was a smell she knew intimately from her years of silent study in the wild, huddled over ancient texts while the winter wind howled outside her secluded cabin in the Blackwood forest. "Sweet nightshade," she observed softly. Her voice was perfectly flat, devoid of the terror he so desperately expected. She tilted her head slightly, analyzing the contents with clinical detachment. Distilled with crushed valerian root, a potent measure of black lotus, and a single drop of moon poppy. It is a highly concentrated paralytic, a widow's draught. The physician swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically in his thin throat. A violent shudder racked his frail frame. "It is a mercy," he pleaded, his tone cracking under the weight of his own profound guilt. "The Ashen Throne does not simply kill Evangeline. It unmakes you. It reaches into your chest, finds the weakness in your blood, and burns your bones to ash, while your mind remains fully conscious to feel the agony. Lady Beatrice Thorne will orchestrate a moment where you are forced against that petrified wood. I cannot stop her. Commander Ronald Cale and his guard will not stop her. They have already turned their faces away." He pushed the vial of nightshade elixir an inch closer to her calloused hands, his breathing hitched, desperate and shallow. "Drink this before dawn," he urged, his weary silvered irises finally lifting to meet hers. They were shining with unshed cowardly tears. "You will feel no pain." A slight chill, a profound weariness, and then a painless sleep. You will simply fade out into the dark, untouched by the cursed magic of the sovereign seat. It is the only escape you have left. Evangeline did not reach for the glass. Her pulse remained a steady, unbroken rhythm beneath her skin. She looked at the terrified old man, reading the physiological betrayals of his body. His pupils were completely dilated. His breathing was frantic. His inner wolf was whimpering, crushed under the absolute shame of a healer offering death instead of protection. He was not here to save her. He was here to spare himself the psychological torment of watching an innocent human be murdered in his king's halls. He wanted her to erase herself so his conscience could remain clean. He wanted her to be complicit in her own execution. Slowly, deliberately, the quiet girl reached out with her scarred right hand. She pressed her fingertips against the cool glass of the vial. She pushed it back across the table, sliding it firmly toward the physician's trembling fingers. "I will not drink it," Evangeline stated. She did not raise her voice. She did not inflect with anger, bitterness, or righteous indignation. Her silence was a shield, and her dignity was an impenetrable wall. "I do not seek an easy exit. You do not understand the agony of that wood," Gideon hissed. Genuine panic bled into his tone, stripping away his scholarly veneer. He pressed his hands flat against the table, leaning forward as if he could physically force her to comprehend her impending doom. "You are wolfless. You have no regenerative magic, no beast to absorb the shock of the ancient hex. You will shatter like glass." "I understand perfectly," she replied, her dark eyes locking onto his with a terrifying, absolute calm. "But I do not drink poison to grant you a clean conscience, Elder Gideon Croft. You offer me a quiet death, so you do not have to live with the noise of my murder. If Lady Beatrice Thorne and the court intend to burn me, they will have to look me in the eye when they light the fire. I will not make it easy for them. I will not step aside." The physician recoiled as if she had struck him. The sheer, unyielding fortitude in her posture shattered his desperate illusion of mercy. He looked at the vial of lethal shadow, then back to the small, ragged girl who had survived the deep winter alone. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that she was stronger than any warrior currently residing in the keep. Her quiet endurance was a fortress he could not breach. A ragged sob tore free from Gideon's throat. He snatched the vial off the solid oak table, his fingers curling painfully tight around the glass, and turned his back on her. He fled the apothecary chambers without another word. His boots echoed frantically down the corridor until the iron-banded door clicked shut behind him, plunging the room back into absolute, suffocating silence. Evangeline sat alone for a long moment. She picked up the solid granite pestle. She resumed grinding the winter root, but the air in the room had grown unbearably dense, tainted by the acidic smell of the old man's fear and the lingering threat of assassination. The quiet rhythm of her labor was no longer enough to ground her. She needed the biting reality of the winter wind to clear the stench of cowardice from her lungs. She wiped her hands on a coarse linen cloth. She pulled a thin, scavenged wool shawl tightly over her narrow shoulders, tucked her hands into the folds, and slipped out of the subterranean chambers. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors with the silent, fluid grace of a ghost. She instinctively avoided the rigid patrol routes of the armored guard, moving through the deep shadows of the stone arches. She knew how to remain unseen, listening to the clank of iron armor and the steady tread of boots in the distance. She climbed a narrow, spiraling servants' stairwell that smelled of damp stone and rust, pushing open a massive iron-wrought gate at the top. She stepped out into the dead palace gardens. The transition was a physical shock. The freezing midnight air hit her face like a pane of shattered glass. It instantly numbed her cheeks and bit through the inadequate wool of her shawl. But it was clean. It was pure. It smelled of ice and distant pine, stripping the claustrophobia from her mind. It was a cold she knew how to survive. The sprawling courtyard was a desolate monument to the sovereign's ruin. Ancient, skeletal trellises loomed in the dark, like the rib cages of massive forgotten beasts. The soil beneath her boots was hardened to the consistency of black iron. Elaborate stone fountains, carved in the likeness of howling wolves, were choked with thick, spidery patterns of ice. Not a single weed or vine lived here. The ambient necrotic magic of the fortress had bled into the earth, poisoning the roots of every creeping plant and towering oak. It was a graveyard of frozen flora, silent and waiting for an awakening that seemed impossible. Evangeline walked slowly down the central cobblestone path. Her boots crunched softly against the thick frost. The physical isolation of the space was absolute. She stopped beside a shattered stone planter. Beneath a solid, translucent layer of ice, trapped against the blackened earth, a tiny flash of pale color caught her eye. She knelt in the freezing dirt, ignoring the biting cold that seeped through the thin fabric of her dress. She used her calloused thumbnail to carefully chip away the hardened frost. The ice cracked with a sharp, brittle snap, revealing the object underneath. It was a single, withered white rose petal. She picked it up delicately. The fragile plant matter felt like dry, ancient parchment between her fingers. Its edges were curled and browned by the lethal combination of winter frost and magical decay. It was a microscopic tragedy in a vast, ruined world. She brushed her thumb over its surface, an odd pang of recognition humming in her chest. The atmospheric pressure violently shifted, suffocating the freezing winter wind in a single breathless stall. A wave of intense, blistering heat rolled over the cobblestones, melting the frost instantly and sending thin tendrils of white steam curling into the dark air. The sharp, chaotic scent of burning pine, masculine musk, and raw, volatile magic flooded the garden, overwhelming the crisp scent of the night. It was an oppressive, heavy warmth that made the very air feel thick and breathable only by effort. King Alistair Stirling stepped out from the deep shadows of the northern colonnade. Evangeline did not flinch. She remained kneeling in the dirt, the withered petal resting in her open palm, and slowly turned her head to observe the terrifying approach of the monarch. He was a walking catastrophe. Despite the lethal cold of the night, the sovereign wore only a loose, linen shirt, the fabric hanging open to reveal the scarred expanse of his broad chest. He did not feel the winter because his own blood was actively trying to incinerate him. The dark, necrotic veins of the lethal curse pulsed vividly against his throat, glowing with a faint, sickening violet light in the gloom. His thick, dark hair was damp with sweat, and his tempestuous gaze burned with the frantic, trapped agony of a predator fighting a war inside its own veins. He stopped 10 paces away. The physical restraint he exercised was absolute and agonizing. His large hands clenched into fists so tightly that the knuckles went completely white, the thick tendons in his forearms locking like steel cables. He forced his breathing to remain shallow, desperately trying not to inhale her clean, human scent, terrified that his corrupted aura would jump the distance and infect her. "You do not sleep in the sanctuary I provided," Alistair rumbled. His voice was devastatingly low. It carried a rough, vibrating exhaustion that seemed to shake the very stones of the courtyard. It was the sound of a beast barely chained. "The sanctuary smelled of poison and fear," Evangeline replied evenly. She stood up. Her small frame was dwarfed by the sheer architectural scale of the garden and the towering presence of the man before her. She did not brush the dirt from her knees. She simply held her ground, refusing to bow to the dangerous energy rolling off him. "I preferred the honest cold of the grave." The king's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered violently beneath the necrotic veins on his cheek. He looked at the desolate courtyard, his burning gaze sweeping over the skeletal trees and the shattered fountains. The grief radiating from his formidable frame was palpable. It was a crushing, suffocating wave of profound isolation. "No living thing survives the sovereign's shadow," he murmured. His tone dropped to a hollow, echoing whisper. "The earth knows I am rotting. It feels the ancient curse in my blood, and it dies in sympathy. I am a plague upon my own home, Evangeline. I touch the soil, and it turns to ash." Evangeline looked down at the withered white rose petal resting in her scarred hand. She did not offer him empty, comforting platitudes. She did not shrink from the terrifying reality of his destructive power. She saw past the monstrous exterior to the desperate, solitary man trapped within it. "The soil is not dead, King Alistair Sterling," she corrected quietly. Her dark eyes lifted to meet his swirling, agonized stare. "It is completely dormant. It has locked its warmth deep beneath the surface to survive the violent shifts in temperature. It is waiting for the rot to be excised." Alistair took a single, halting step forward. The intense, unnatural heat of his body washed over her, a sudden, desperate contrast to the freezing night. The scent of him grew thicker, wild, pained, and deeply intoxicating, laced with the raw power of an alpha, holding back the edge of madness. The heat emanating from his skin felt like standing before an open hearth fire. The court believed the Ashen Throne requires supreme physical dominance, the monarch gritted out. His voice vibrated with a sudden, fierce intensity. The pain of the curse flared, causing a violent tremor in his broad shoulders. "They believe it drains the weak because they are unworthy. They think my failing health is a lack of brute strength. They are utterly wrong." He took another step. He was now only an arm's length away. The sheer physical gravity of his presence demanded submission, but the wolfless girl simply tilted her head back to maintain eye contact, her spine perfectly straight. Deep within the leather pouch hidden against her chest, the winterbloom seed began to pulse with a slow, deep, resonant rhythm, answering the chaotic hum of his dark magic. The tactile sensation of the seed was a tiny localized warmth against her sternum, distinct from the crushing heat of the king. "The throne does not demand strength," Alistair continued. His storm-grey eyes locked onto hers with a desperate, searching hunger. "It demands an untainted soul. We are lichens. We are born of violence, raised in blood, our inner beasts constantly snarling for dominance. Our souls are burdened, stained by the very nature of our biology. The petrified wood burns us because it is trying to purify a vessel that is fundamentally incapable of purity. It is an ancient judgment. It requires a silence we do not possess." He looked at her chest, staring directly at the place where a wolf should have resided. He saw the empty, hollow quiet of her human biology. He did not see a defect. He saw an absolute, terrifying perfection. He saw a sanctuary he was terrified to claim. Alistair lowered his weary head, leaning down until his face was mere inches from hers. The physical radiation of his cursed blood was a scorching pressure against her freezing skin. He closed his eyes, his thick lashes trembling, and inhaled a slow, deep breath of her scent. It was clean. It smelled of winter root, cold wind, and an unyielding, quiet endurance. There were no violent pheromones, no aggressive posturing of a lesser beast. There was only her. The urge to close the distance, to bury his face in the crook of her neck, and let her cool silence quell the burning rot inside him, was a physical violence tearing him apart. Every instinct screamed at him to touch her, to wrap his massive arms around her fragile frame and let her quiet stillness absorb his roaring agony. Evangeline did not step back. She did not tremble beneath the weight of the most dangerous predator in the realm. She simply held the withered white rose petal, watching the frantic pulse of the curse trying to consume him. She knew that to touch him was to risk everything. But her body did not recoil. Her inner rhythm remained utterly stable, a perfect counter-melody to his chaos. Alistair exhaled a shaky, ragged breath. The iron restraint of his will won out over his desperate hunger for relief. He forced himself to take a labored, staggering step backward, violently pulling his burning aura away from her. The physical exertion of that single backward step cost him dearly. A fresh web of necrotic purple light spidered up the side of his neck. "Go back inside the walls, little gardener," the cursed sovereign whispered roughly. His voice was thick with suppressed agony and profound yearning. He turned his broad back to her, melting back into the deep shadows of the colonnade. "Before the wolves remember you are out here, and before I forget how to keep my distance." He vanished into the dark, leaving Evangeline alone in the freezing courtyard, the sudden absence of his heat making the winter wind feel infinitely colder. She stood quietly in the dark, her fingers tightening around the withered, white petal as she braced her spine against the rising storm. The grand assembly was supposed to be a demonstration of unbroken royal power. Instead, it became the moment the entire world shattered. The throne room of the sovereign's stronghold was a cavernous, suffocating monument to architectural intimidation. Carved entirely from the same unforgiving black basalt that formed the mountain's roots, the hall was designed to make any individual standing within it feel infinitely small, an insignificant speck against the weight of a predatory empire. Massive iron chandeliers hung suspended from the vaulted ceiling by thick, rusted chains, their hundreds of oil lamps casting long, flickering shadows that danced violently against the dark, polished walls. The ambient temperature in the room was unbearable. 300 high-born lichens stood shoulder to shoulder, their collective body heat and the nervous, aggressive energy of their inner beasts turning the air into a sweltering, airless oven. The atmosphere was thick with the chaotic, warring scents of terrified sweat, unsheathed ambition, and the metallic, bitter tang of burning ozone. Every predator in the room was acutely aware that the Empire was bleeding out. They had gathered like vultures circling a dying leviathan, waiting for the final collapse. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a jagged dais of raw stone, sat the Ashen Throne. It was a terrifying artifact. Forged from ancient petrified black wood, the sovereign's seat did not reflect the flickering lamplight. It absorbed it entirely, creating a localized void of absolute, freezing darkness in the center of the stifling room. The throne emanated a relentless, crushing gravitational pull, a necrotic magic that hummed with the steady, lethal rhythm of a starving predator. The air around it shimmered with the violent drop in temperature, frost spidering across the base of the dais, despite the overwhelming heat radiating from the gathered wolves. No living thing had ever survived a casual encounter with the petrified wood. It demanded supreme, untainted resilience, and in the absence of absolute perfection, it turned flesh and bone to dust in a single heartbeat. It was the ultimate arbiter of power. And right now it was waiting for a meal. King Alistair Sterling sat rigidly on the lowest step of the dais, He refused to ascend to the actual seat. The monarch was a portrait of catastrophic, agonizing ruin. The lethal ancient curse had accelerated with terrifying speed since his violent flare-up in the Dead Gardens. The necrotic, spidery veins of dark magic no longer just traced his throat. They had crawled up the sharp line of his jaw and down the muscular expanse of his broad chest, pulsing with a sickly violet luminescence that was visible even in the dim light. He wore no armor, only a heavy mantle of midnight fur draped over his shoulders, leaving his chest bare, as if the mere friction of a linen shirt was too excruciating to bear. His massive hands gripped the edges of the stone step so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. The thick tendons in his forearms locked in a desperate, vibrating stalemate against his own failing biology. He was drowning in physical agony. His haunted gaze was locked in a 1,000-yard stare, glazed with the sheer, unrelenting effort required simply to draw breath. The Alpha's inner beast snarled wildly against the cage of his ribs, lashing out at the dark rot consuming its blood. But the fight was nearly over. Every inhale sounded like grinding glass. Every exhale was a shuddering testament to a will that refused to break. He was a king preparing to die in front of his court. Standing 10 paces to the right of the dais, Commander Ronald Cale watched his sovereign deteriorate. The head of the royal guard was an immovable mountain of dark steel and scarred leather. His massive arms were crossed over his broad chest, his heavy wolf fur cloak completely still in the stagnant air. Ronald's hazel eyes were clinical, cold, and relentlessly calculating. He felt the collective, predatory tension of the assembled nobles pressing in on the dais, testing the perimeter of the guard's defenses. He knew that the moment the monarch collapsed, a bloodbath of succession would immediately follow. His duty was to the survival of the crown, not the man. He kept his jaw locked, his breathing shallow, silently waiting for the inevitable transition of power. He had already accepted the brutal calculus of the night. Directly opposite the commander, positioned at the very front of the aristocratic crowd, stood Lady Beatrice Thorne. She was breathtakingly radiant, a pristine, sharp contrast to the suffocating gloom of the execution chamber. She wore an elaborate gown of cascading silver silk and pale grey velvet, the fabric whispering softly against the basalt floor with her every calculated movement. Her pale, calculating gaze gleamed with a predatory, victorious light. The scent of her rolled across the tense space, sweet, cloying lilies heavily masking the bitter, underlying aroma of poisoned honey. Beatrice was completely in her element. She had orchestrated this public assembly, under the guise of demonstrating the crown's stability, knowing full well it would force the cursed sovereign past his physical breaking point. She had watched the pieces of her elaborate trap fall perfectly into place. She offered a flawless, shallow smile to the decaying ruler. It was a mask of polite concern draped over pure malevolence. "Your Majesty," the noblewoman purred, her elegant voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silence of the hall. "The court is deeply distressed by your visible suffering. The realm requires a demonstration of absolute strength to quell the rising panic in the outer territories. We beg you, ascend your rightful seat. Let the magic of the Ashen Throne stabilize your aura, as it has done for the generations of conquerors before you." It was a flawless, lethal trap. If the Alpha refused to sit, he publicly admitted his terminal weakness, inviting an immediate coup. If he ascended the dais and touched the cursed wood in his severely compromised state, the petrified throne would instantly consume his remaining life force, burning him to ash before the eyes of his subjects. Alistair did not answer. He couldn't. The physical effort required to speak would break his fragile hold on consciousness. A violent tremor racked his massive frame, a low guttural sound of raw agony vibrating in his chest. Beatrice's smile widened slightly, a microscopic tightening of her painted lips. She turned her head, her pale eyes locking onto the heavy iron doors at the far end of the grand hall. "If the sovereign lacks the strength to ascend," she announced smoothly, raising her voice so every lichen in the room could hear the damning decree, "then he must be fortified. Summon the royal apothecary. Let the human servant administer the medicinal draughts. The court demands the king be tended to. The heavy iron doors groaned on their massive hinges, scraping against the stone. Evangeline Vance walked into the labyrinth of teeth. She did not hesitate. She did not shrink beneath the sudden, crushing weight of 300 hostile, glowing eyes, turning to lock onto her small frame. She wore the same coarse, simple dress of grey wool she had worn since her exile, her small hands bare, her dark hair pulled back into a severe practical knot. In her hands, she carried a simple wooden tray bearing a single steaming ceramic cup of crushed winter root and yarrow. The aroma of the earthy, bitter herbs instantly cut through the cloying stench of Beatrice's lilies, a clean, sharp anchor in a room drowning in poison. The heat of the room hit her like a physical blow, a sweltering wall of animal aggression and territorial panic, but Evangeline did not sweat. Her pulse remained a slow, methodical drumbeat beneath her pale skin. She anchored her focus entirely on the physical sensations of the present, the rough texture of the wooden tray against her calloused palms. The steady, biting chill radiating from the far end of the hall, where the void lay waiting. The strange, comforting pulse of the winterbloom seed resting against her sternum, vibrating with a slow, heavy rhythm that mirrored the frantic beating of the dying Alpha's heart. She walked down the central aisle, the crowd of towering, muscular lichens reluctantly parting before her. They sneered, they bared their fangs. Their inner beasts whimpered in aggressive confusion at her complete lack of a dominant scent, appalled that a wolfless anomaly was permitted to walk among the elite. The murmurs of disgust rippled through the ranks, a wave of aristocratic venom designed to break her composure. Evangeline ignored them. She was a ghost moving through a graveyard. We are small things in a world of teeth. She had survived the mockery of her own pack. She had endured the freezing isolation of the Blackwood forest. The silent judgment of a dying court meant absolutely nothing to her. She kept her spine flawlessly straight, her gaze fixed forward. She reached the base of the jagged dais. Alistair slowly lifted his heavy head. The moment his swirling, agonized stare locked onto her plain, stoic face, a violent shudder ripped through his massive chest. The intense, chaotic heat of his cursed aura surged, desperately reaching out toward the cool, quiet silence of her human biology. He wanted to command her to run. He wanted to roar at the treacherous court to clear the hall, to protect her from the lethal gravity of the throne room. But his jaw was locked tight, his teeth grinding together so fiercely that blood seeped from his gums. The veins in his neck bulged, black and violet, as he fought the overwhelming, instinctual urge to pull her into his arms and shield her from the vultures. Beatrice stepped forward, closing the distance to the edge of the dais. Her frigid stare was fixed on Evangeline, with absolute unadulterated hatred. "The king cannot reach his chalice," the ambitious strategist stated, her voice a soothing, deadly purr. She reached into the folds of her silver silk gown and withdrew a length of deep crimson fabric, the poisoned crimson velvet ribbon. She let it cascade from her pale fingers, dropping it deliberately onto the second step of the dais, mere inches from the king's violently trembling boots. "And the armrests of the sovereign's seat are thick with dust. It is a disgrace. Pick up the velvet girl, ascend the dais, polish the petrified wood of the ashen throne, and then serve your master his draught." It was a death sentence delivered with a polite smile. To touch the ribbon bare-handed would introduce a lethal paralytic into her bloodstream, a concentrated toxin designed to stop her heart within seconds. To touch the throne would turn her to ash, obliterating her entirely. To refuse a direct command in front of the assembled court would result in immediate execution by the royal guard for treason. Commander Ronald Cale did not move. He kept his hazel eyes fixed straight ahead, actively choosing to look the other way as the trap snapped shut. He felt a flicker of grim respect for the silent girl, but he would not draw his blade to save her. Evangeline looked at the crimson ribbon resting on the dark stone. She recognized the faint, acrid smell of silver root and nightshade woven into the velvet. She looked up at the stunningly beautiful noblewoman who had engineered her absolute ruin, the woman who had sought to replace her quiet competence with loud, poisonous ambition. Evangeline did not glare. She did not offer a dramatic speech of defiance. She did not cry. She simply stepped over the ribbon. A collective, shocked gasp rippled through the assembled nobles. Beatrice's flawless smile shattered, her pale face flushing with sudden violent fury at the blatant, quiet disrespect. Evangeline took the first step up the jagged dais. The temperature plummeted instantly. The air around the petrified wood was a localized blizzard, a freezing, suffocating void that sought to strip the warmth from her blood. Her breath plumed into white clouds in the sudden cold. She took the second step. The ambient necrotic magic of the throne pulled at her like a physical undertow, a heavy, sinking pressure in her chest. "Stop her!" Beatrice shrieked, her aristocratic composure entirely forgotten. "Commander Cale, the human is defying a direct order. Cut her down!" Ronald's hand dropped to the pommel of his broadsword, his knuckles whitening. But before the massive soldier could draw the steel, the world completely unraveled. King Alistair Stirling's iron restraint finally broke. The curse violently surged, overwhelming his failing heart. With a sickening, wet crack, the Alpha's massive body spasmed backward, thrown off balance by the explosive internal pain. He was falling directly toward the jagged, lethal obsidian of the petrified seat. If his corrupted flesh touched the ancient wood in this state, he would detonate into ash. Evangeline dropped the wooden tray. It shattered against the stone, the ceramic cup exploding, sending hot winter root tea splashing across the basalt. She did not scream. She lunged forward, throwing her small, fragile body between the collapsing mountain of a king and the lethal void of the ancient artifact. She caught his massive weight with her left shoulder, the physical impact driving the breath from her lungs in a brutal, agonizing rush. The sheer force of his backward momentum dragged them both dangerously close to the seat. To stop them from crashing entirely, Evangeline threw her right arm out, desperately seeking leverage. Her bare, heavily scarred palm slammed flat against the jagged black armrest of the ashen throne. The grand hall fell into absolute, deafening silence. Time stopped. 300 wolves held their breath, waiting for the inevitable horror. They waited for the human girl to scream. They waited for the ancient, hungry magic to turn her fragile bones to smoking dust, to consume her insignificant life in a single, violent flash of necrotic fire. But there was no fire. She did not burn. The moment her calloused skin made contact with the indestructible petrified wood, the excruciating cold of the void vanished. A sudden, massive shockwave of pure, blinding kinetic energy ripped outward from the point of contact. The sensation was not pain. It was an overwhelming, terrifying clarity. The ancient curse embedded in the stone rushed up her arm, a torrent of dark, aggressive magic, attempting to find the weakness in her biology. It searched for the violence of a wolf. It searched for the taint of a beast. It found only absolute, unyielding human silence. Hidden beneath the coarse wool of her dress, the dormant winterbloom seed detonated, the sacred thread woven between her soul and the ancient magic of the keep pulled taut, singing with a crystalline, deafening resonance. Evangeline's dark eyes widened as a blinding, liquid silver light bled from the thick scar on her palm, pouring directly into the porous, decaying black stone. The indestructible basalt beneath her hand hissed, the sound sharp and violent like water hitting a forge. Then the throne began to crack. A web of brilliant, molten gold fissures spidered outward from beneath her fingertips, racing across the armrests, plunging down the back of the seat and fracturing the base of the dais. The dark, necrotic magic of the ancient curse shrieked, a high, unnatural sound that shattered the glass of the overhead lamps. The void was being violently, systematically annihilated. From the golden fissures, life erupted. Thick, vibrant green vines burst through the petrified wood, tearing the indestructible stone apart with the unstoppable, terrifying force of nature reclaiming a graveyard. The vines wrapped around the jagged obsidian, spiraling upward in a chaotic, beautiful frenzy. Within seconds, massive, radiant golden briar roses bloomed violently into existence, their velvet petals unfurling in the stifling air. Clustered between the gold were perfect, snow-white lilies, their trumpets opening to release a suffocatingly rich, intoxicating wave of pure floral fragrance. The scent of spring, rain, and blooming life exploded across the grand hall, instantly annihilating the smell of ozone, fear, and poisoned honey. The heavy, oppressive heat of the room was swept away by a sudden crisp breeze that seemed to generate from the throne itself, washing over the stunned court with the restorative chill of a high mountain morning. Evangeline stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the living, breathing floral tapestry that had completely consumed the terrifying artifact. The ashen throne was gone. In its place stood a seat of vibrant, overwhelming life, blooming wildly beneath her scarred hand. Beneath her, King Alistair Stirling gasped. The Alpha dragged in a massive, ragged breath, his broad chest heaving, the sickly, violet luminescence of the necrotic veins tracing his throat flickered, dulled, and then vanished entirely. The grey, ashen pallor of his skin was instantly replaced by the flush of healthy, roaring vitality. The curse was broken. The rot had been completely excised from his blood. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his massive muscles shifting effortlessly, unburdened by the crushing agony for the first time in a decade. He turned his head, his storm-grey eyes, now crystal clear and burning with absolute, instinctual reverence, locking onto the small girl standing beside the blooming throne. Alistair did not rise to his full, terrifying height. He stayed on the stone floor. Slowly, deliberately, the most powerful predator in the realm shifted his weight, lowered his heavy head, and planted his knee firmly against the hard basalt at Evangeline's feet. He offered her the absolute submission of a sovereign. A collective, whimpering sound echoed through the cavernous hall. It was not a sound of fear, but of profound, instinctual awe. The inner wolves of the assembled nobles recognized the ancient, divine truth of the moment. They were not bowing to physical dominance. They were bowing to a miracle of blood and silence. One by one, the aristocratic Leekens dropped to their knees. The heavy clatter of armored guards kneeling echoed like a rolling thunderclap. Even Commander Ronald Cale, his rigid discipline shattered by the sheer impossibility of the blooming wood, slowly sank to one knee, bowing his head in profound respect. Only Lady Beatrice Thorne remained standing, staring in absolute, uncomprehending horror at the wolfless girl who had just broken an unbreakable curse. Evangeline Vance did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply stood beside the golden briar roses, her dark eyes looking down at the kneeling king, her spine perfectly straight. She was no longer a discarded Omega. She was the anchor of an empire. At the base of the fractured dais, the king's massive shoulders slowly rose and fell as he drew in deep, clean breaths of the floral-scented air. For a decade, every inhalation had been a desperate, agonizing battle against the grinding rot of his own corrupted blood. Now, his lungs expanded effortlessly. The sheer physical relief washing over his formidable frame was palpable. He looked up at Evangeline. His storm-grey eyes were no longer clouded by pain or the frantic, trapped agony of a dying predator. They were crystal clear, sharp, and burning with an absolute, instinctual reverence that bordered on worship. He did not see a discarded, wolfless anomaly. He saw his salvation. He saw a sanctuary he had spent his entire life believing he did not deserve. Then, a sudden, jagged sound shattered the profound silence of the grand hall. It was a sharp, unhinged gasp, followed by a frantic rustling of heavy silk. The ambitious noblewoman stood completely alone in the center of the vast, kneeling court. Her pristine silver and pale grey velvet gown trembled violently around her frame. Her pale blonde braids, meticulously arranged to project an aura of flawless aristocratic supremacy, seemed suddenly severe and brittle against her flushed, frantic face. Her ice-blue eyes were blown wide, darting erratically from the blooming golden roses to the kneeling sovereign, and finally to the quiet, stoic girl standing on the dais. Her internal logic was failing. This was mathematically impossible. The petrified wood was supposed to turn the weak to ash. It was supposed to expose the human as a fragile, useless defect and force the king into Beatrice's waiting, pure-blooded arms. She had forged the ancestral documents. She had orchestrated the hostility. She had carefully planted the poisoned crimson velvet ribbon. Every calculated move had been flawless, and yet the cursed seat was blooming, the monarch was healed, and the entire royal court was bowing to the very creature she had sought to obliterate. "No," Beatrice whispered. The single word was a ragged, breathless sound that carried through the dead silence of the hall. She took a staggering step forward, the sharp, cloying scent of lilies and poisoned honey spiked in the air, a sour, desperate stench of pure panic bleeding through her expensive perfumes. Her inner beast, driven mad by the sudden, absolute collapse of its perceived dominance, began to thrash violently beneath her skin. "No," Beatrice shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat in a feral, unhinged scream that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Her aristocratic mask disintegrated entirely. "This is a trick, a foul human hex. She is wolfless. She is nothing." Evangeline slowly turned her head to look down at the screaming noblewoman. Her dark eyes were perfectly calm, unreadable, and beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. She did not flinch at the sudden volume. She did not take a step back or seek the protection of the kneeling guards. She simply watched the architect of her ruin self-destruct. We are small things in a world of teeth. She had always known this, but tonight the teeth had finally broken against her quiet endurance. Beatrice snapped. The profound, quiet dignity of Evangeline's gaze was the final insult. Abandoning all pretense of royal grace, the noblewoman lunged forward. She did not draw a weapon. Her rage was too primal, too immediate. She simply raised her hands, her long, manicured nails extending into sharp, lethal claws as she charged the dais. Her silver silk gown caught on the rough basalt floor, tearing loudly, but she did not care. She intended to drag the human girl down from the blooming wood and tear the fragile throat from her neck with her bare hands. She intended to correct the impossible reality by force. But the world had fundamentally shifted. The dying Leviathan was no longer bleeding out. Before Beatrice could even reach the first step of the dais, the air in the room violently compressed. King Alistair Stirling moved with a speed that defied biological comprehension. Without the Winterbane curse tethering his muscles and draining his life force, the Alpha was a terrifying god of war restored to his absolute prime. He did not merely stand. He erupted from his kneeling position, a blur of dark hair and devastating kinetic energy. The physical displacement of the air as he moved sent a shockwave across the hall, extinguishing the nearest oil lamps in a sudden gust of wind. He intercepted Beatrice with terrifying precision. His massive right hand clamped around the noblewoman's throat, lifting her entirely off the floor in a single, fluid motion. The sheer, overwhelming force of his healthy alpha aura slammed into the room. It was no longer the suffocating, burning ozone of necrotic decay. It was a crushing, magnificent pressure of summer storms, wild pine, and the absolute, undisputed dominance of a sovereign protecting his mate. The intense atmospheric weight forced the heads of the kneeling lichens lower to the ground. They could not look up. The king's power was absolute. Beatrice choked, her feral scream instantly cut off as her air supply was severed. Her hands scrabbled desperately at the thick, iron-hard muscles of the king's forearm, her claws scraping uselessly against his skin without leaving a single mark. Her once haughty eyes bulged in pure, unadulterated terror as she looked down at the man she had tried to manipulate. Alistair's storm-grey eyes were gone. In their place, his irises had shifted to a blinding, molten gold, the unmistakable, terrifying marker of a fully awakened royal wolf completely aligned with its human consciousness. He did not look at her with anger. He looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a predator discarding a diseased carcass. "You speak of hexes and tricks, Lady Thorne," Alistair rumbled. His voice was a flawless, resonant baritone that vibrated through the very foundations of the keep. It lacked the rough, grinding agony it had carried for years. It was the voice of a true king. "When it was you who poisoned the soil of my court, You forged the ledgers to banish her from the Valdron pack. You sought to weaponize my failing health to secure a crown that would never belong to you. And tonight, you attempted to use the ancient magic of this hall to execute an innocent soul. He tightened his grip fractionally. Beatrice's face began to turn a sickly pale shade of blue. She kicked her feet in the air, her torn silver gown fluttering around her like a broken flag. The cloying scent of her lilies was completely crushed beneath the overwhelming, wild pine of the alpha. But you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power, the monarch continued, his golden eyes narrowing. He did not raise his voice. The quiet, lethal certainty in his tone was infinitely more terrifying than a roar. Power is not the ability to force others to their knees. It is the strength to stand in the freezing dark, entirely alone, and refuse to break. She possesses a silence you will never comprehend. And she has saved this empire from the rot you sought to feed upon. Alistair turned his head slightly, his golden gaze sweeping over the kneeling crowd until it locked onto the massive armoured figure of the head guard. "Commander Ronald Cale," the king commanded. Ronald instantly rose from his knee. The massive soldier moved with rigid military precision, his hazel eyes entirely devoid of sympathy as he marched toward the center of the confrontation. He had stood by and watched the political decay of the court for too long, bound by his duty to a dying sovereign. Now the crown was restored, and the executioner's blade had found its proper target. "Your Majesty," Ronald replied, his deep baritone echoing in the hall. "Lady Beatrice Thorne is hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and privileges within the realm," Alistair declared coldly, never breaking eye contact with the gasping, terrified woman in his grip. "She is guilty of high treason, conspiracy to commit regicide, and the attempted murder of the savior of the throne. Arrest her, bind her in iron, and throw her into the deepest cell of the subterranean block. Let her wait in the dark for her final judgment." Ronald Cale did not hesitate. He reached onto his heavy leather belt and unhooked a thick set of cold iron shackles. The metal clanked heavily in the quiet room. Iron was a brutal restraint for lichens. It burned their skin and suppressed their shifting magic, a severe punishment reserved only for the worst offenders. Alistair dropped the noblewoman. Beatrice collapsed onto the hard basalt floor in a heap of torn silver silk and pale limbs. She hit the stone hard, gasping desperately for air, her pristine braids unraveling in a chaotic mess around her shoulders. She was completely broken. The arrogant, cold strategist who had confidently planned an empire's downfall was gone, replaced by a whimpering, terrified prisoner. Before she could even attempt to crawl away, Ronald's heavy boot came down squarely on the center of her back, pinning her to the floor. The commander seized her wrists, hauling her arms behind her back with ruthless efficiency. The heavy restraint snapped shut. The metallic click of the locks was a final, undeniable sound of absolute ruin. The iron immediately began to sear her skin. Beatrice let out a shrill, agonizing wail, a pitiful sound that held no dignity, no stoicism. She writhed on the floor, weeping and begging for mercy, pleading with the nobles who had eagerly listened to her whispers only hours before. But the court remained completely silent. Not a single lichen moved to help her. They kept their heads bowed, actively severing themselves from the disgraced woman. "Remove her," Alistair ordered quietly, turning his back on the pathetic display. Commander Cale hauled Beatrice to her feet by the heavy iron chain. She stumbled, her legs refusing to support her weight, her sobs echoing wildly off the vaulted ceiling. Ronald dragged her away, marching her down the long central aisle and out through the massive iron doors. The heavy gates slammed shut behind them with a reverberating crash, cutting off her cries and sealing her fate. The throne room was finally clean. Alistair Sterling stood alone at the base of the dais. The molten gold in his eyes slowly receded, giving way once more to the deep, swirling storm grey of his human consciousness. The overwhelming, crushing pressure of his alpha aura softened, pulling back until it was merely a warm, protective mantle covering the room. He exhaled a long, slow breath, letting the final remnants of his decade-long nightmare bleed out into the ether. He turned to face the days. Evangeline had watched the entire violent confrontation without moving a single muscle. She stood beside the blooming golden briar roses, her small, scarred hands resting quietly at her sides. She had not begged for the king's intervention. She had not panicked when Beatrice charged. She had maintained her straight spine and her impenetrable calm, a solitary anchor in a sea of chaos. Alistair slowly ascended the stone steps. He did not move with the terrifying speed of a predator anymore. He moved with the careful, deliberate hesitation of a man approaching something sacred. He felt the intense, radiant life force emanating from the floral tapestry covering the ancient wood. The curse was truly gone. The void had been filled with light. He stopped on the step just below her, intentionally keeping his eyes level with hers, so he did not tower over her fragile frame. The physical proximity was overwhelming. Without the barrier of his toxic, burning curse, the scent of him was pure and breathtaking, a deep, grounding aroma of rain-washed pine and warm leather. He looked at her face. He saw the dark, observant eyes that had seen the worst of his kingdom and refused to blink. He saw the sharp angle of her jaw, set with unyielding endurance. He saw the small, calloused girl who had dragged his bleeding beast through the snow, and who had just shattered the most powerful artifact in his empire with a single touch. Alistair slowly raised his right hand. His thick fingers hovered for a fraction of a second, asking for a silent permission his beast desperately craved. When Evangeline did not pull back, he gently reached out and took her scarred right hand in his. The physical contrast was profound. His massive, deeply tanned hand completely engulfed hers. His skin was incredibly warm, a safe, steady heat that radiated directly into her freezing bones. There was no burning necrotic magic. There was no pain. It was the first time in his reign he had touched another living being without causing them harm. He turned her hand over, his thumb lightly tracing the thick, raised scar across her palm where the silver ritual blade had cut her. He traced the exact point where her human blood had poured into the petrified wood and birthed a miracle. "They called you a defect," Alistair whispered. His voice was thick with a profound, overwhelming emotion, a reverent awe that brought a sudden tightness to his throat. "They cast you into the snow because you possessed no beast to snarl at the moon, because you were quiet." Evangeline looked down at their joined hands. The tactile sensation of his gentle, secure grip sent a strange, fluttering warmth through her chest. It was a terrifyingly safe feeling, a feeling of absolute, unconditional protection. "I am wolfless," she replied evenly, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet hall. "I cannot shift, I cannot fight in their wars." Alistair looked up, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion. He slowly shook his head, his thumb continuing its gentle, soothing rhythm over her scars. "You did not need a beast," the king murmured, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate whisper meant only for her ears. "You possessed a power older and deeper than any shifting magic in this realm. You possessed the courage to touch a rotting king, and the silence to heal an empire. The throne did not break you, Evangeline. It bloomed for you, because it recognized its true master." He slowly lowered his head, pressing his lips gently against the scarred palm of her hand. It was an act of complete, absolute submission. It was a vow of eternal fealty from a sovereign to the woman who had saved his soul. The touch sent a physical shockwave of warmth straight to the dormant seed against her heart, locking the sacred thread between them into a permanent, unbreakable bond. The court remained kneeling in the silence, witnessing the quiet, undisputed crowning of their new Luna. 3 months later, the thawing of the obsidian keep was complete. The transition was not merely a change in the weather. It was a systemic absolute resurrection of a dead empire. The suffocating, bitter winter that had gripped the mountains for a decade finally broke, giving way to a brilliant, vibrant spring. The skeletal trellises in the grand courtyards were now heavy with thick green vines and bursting with thousands of white moonflowers. The stone fountains ran clear and bright, the ice shattered and forgotten. The heavy, necrotic atmosphere of the fortress had been entirely scrubbed away, replaced by the clean, crisp scent of blooming flora and fresh mountain rain. In the royal solar, the heavy velvet drapes had been pulled back, allowing the golden afternoon light to flood the massive chamber. The oppressive heat of the cursed hearth was gone. In its place, a gentle, crackling fire burned merrily, casting warm, dancing shadows against the polished basalt walls. Evangeline Sterling sat in a plush armchair near the hearth, a heavy, ancient leather-bound ledger resting open on her lap. She wore a simple, elegant gown of soft midnight blue, the fabric comfortable and practical. She was still quiet. She still moved with the silent, fluid grace of a survivor, but the deep, hollow emptiness in her chest was gone, replaced by a profound, secure peace. Her calloused hands slowly turned the crisp parchment pages, her sharp mind effortlessly reorganizing the royal apothecaries and dismantling the lingering corruption of the old court. She had not become a loud, aggressive queen. She had remained exactly who she was, a brilliant, stoic observer who mended broken things. A heavy, familiar tread echoed on the floorboards. King Alistair Sterling stepped into the solar. He wore no crown, only a simple tunic and dark trousers, his dark hair falling loose around his shoulders. He looked remarkably young, the deep lines of pain and exhaustion completely erased from his handsome face. His slate-colored eyes crinkled at the corners as he looked at his wife. The fearsome, dangerous alpha who had terrorized the realm was entirely domesticated within these walls, his massive frame radiating nothing but absolute, unconditional warmth. He crossed the room, stepping behind her chair. He did not speak. He simply leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of her head, his large hands resting gently on her narrow shoulders. The tactile reassurance of his touch was immediate. It was a daily ritual, a quiet affirmation of his devotion and his gratitude for the sanctuary she provided. Evangeline stopped reading. She reached up with her right hand, her fingers tracing the warm, solid muscle of his forearm. The thick scar on her palm brushed against his skin. He did not flinch. He never flinched. The Northern Territories have submitted their revised treaties, Evangeline murmured softly, leaning her head back against his chest. She listened to the steady, strong rhythm of his healthy heart. They are asking for cuttings from the throne room. They believe the golden roses hold the cure for the winter fevers. Alistair chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated pleasantly against her spine. He stepped around the chair and sank to the floor, crossing his long legs and resting his arms on the armrest beside her, perfectly content to sit at her feet. "Let them have the cuttings," the king smiled, his eyes warm and completely unguarded. "But they will quickly learn that the magic is not in the petals. It is in the hands of the one who plants them." He reached up, taking her scarred hand in his, and brought it to his lips once more. The quiet sanctuary they had built was impregnable. The world outside could rage with politics and shifting beasts, but within these stone walls, the frozen winter had finally ended. The curse was broken, not by ancient blood magic or brutal dominance, but by the quiet choices of two souls who refused to stay cold. It was about choosing warmth over cold, hope over fear, and love over duty, the kind that lasts. Thank you for listening to this complete story. If this tale of quiet endurance warmed your hearth, please take 2 seconds to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, did her silent dignity break your heart, or did you savor the sight of the treacherous noblewoman falling in chains?